Good morning. Well, it's currently morning for me. I think we're on the 10th of March and the sunshine is streaming into my potting shed. Just checked the greenhouse and we had about, well, over this last couple of days, at some point it's gone down to -7 in there. But everything's warming up now and I think that's the end of the cold snap for now. But I digress. This isn't about gardening. This is about cider making. I had inundated requests from my beautiful subscribers. I'm joking. One person asked me if I could go over the process for making cider. And obviously it's too early in the year to make cider yet. I'm going to be making cider, God willing that I get a good apple harvest. I'll be making cider, at the back end of autumn. But I have got my notes. And last season was my first year of making cider. But here we go. First things first, you need an incredibly large amount of apples to make cider. So to give you an idea, those kind of big black buckets that you usually use for washing the car. We had 3 of those jam-packed full of apples, plus about half a, maybe Walker's crisp size box full. And that delivered 1.5 demijohns. A demijohn my personal demijohns hold 5 litres. So 7.5 litres of cider from 3.5 buckets of apples. It's precious stuff if you're using all of those apples, but our harvest was huge. I'd already got sick to the back teeth of processing apples for apple pies. I'd got apple in the freezer. I'd got jars of apple. I'd got jars of apple and blackberry. So we really did have these going spare to use. So first things first, I got these buckets of apples and I chopped them. Now we invested in one of these big grinding things. Apple grinders, fruit grinders, you'll see them on Amazon. And it was pretty brilliant, actually. Big hopper, you chip the apples in, grind away on a big crank handle, and it chops them all. But, you could chop them by hand. You could go really old school and chop them by hand, or you could chop them in your processor, batches at a time. So after that, we put the chopped apples into our apple press. So this is one of these barrel things with a turny handle on the top, and you wind it down and squeeze and squeeze and squeeze, and all the apple juice is squashed out of the apples and it runs out into a bucket you have underneath. Again, if you've got a juicer, you could go old school, or you could do some manual mashing up, have it in a muslin bag and let the apple juice drip out. It's going to be a long process, but not beyond the realms of possibility. So moving along, assuming you've worked out a way to chop your apples and then get the juice out of them. Thank you, cars. After that, it's pretty plain sailing. And here's the interesting thing about making cider. You don't add any sugar. All of the sugar is coming out of the apples, which is completely different to when you're making homemade wine, where you're going to be adding quite a considerable amount of, almost pound for pound, so a pound of fruit, a pound of sugar, a bit like jam making. So with cider, you don't have to add any additional sugar. You're going to capture all of the natural sugars from within the apple. And here's the other fascinating thing. You don't wash the apples traditionally because there's natural yeast growing all over the apple skin. And that natural yeast is what will ferment the sugars in the apple juice to create the cider. Now, it was my first time making cider and I wasn't brave enough to let that happen because, it's a bit hit and miss. It depends what type of yeast you've got on your apples, but also what other kinds of yeast you might have floating around in your atmosphere. They could end up having a yeast punch up and you wouldn't get a very good ferment. So I strained the apple juice, I put it in my demijohns, and then I added some winemaking yeast. Those generally come in a packet, and I think there's about 5 grams, and I put half of a sachet packet into each demijohn and just gently shook it up. I put an airlock on top of the demijohn, and that's it. That is cider making. Of course, it's now got to move into its fermentation stage, and it was quite slow. So I'm reading my notes, and I've written, activity was slow to get going. We started on a Sunday, and there was no real activity until Tuesday morning, when a frost formed, but by that late afternoon, the airlocks were burping away. And I put a note here, it's a cold room in November. So this was in my utility room. I do have a radiator in there, but it just comes on for about an hour and a half in the morning and an hour and a half in the evening. So it's generally cold. I make a further note. So this is in November, and I'm not, November the 22nd. So by the 2nd of December, it's working well in the demijohns and looks a lovely golden colour. Now so it's already starting to clear, it's beginning to clear, and I think I left it another couple of weeks after that, and by that time you're going to get a thick sediment form on the bottom of the demijohn. That's called lees, and it's all the dead yeast and fruit particles. Now you can leave that, but there's a school of thought that says you're going to get an off taste if there's too much of that sat at the bottom of a demijohn. So what I did was I used a siphon to siphon off the clear cider into a clean, sterilised demijohn. And that's where it's been sitting ever since. So it carried on working, and I think the last time I saw it burp in the airlock was over a month ago, well over a month ago. And now it's beautifully clear and it's ready to bottle. And if you take a look at my short feed, there's a little video on using an hydrometer, and I'll talk a bit more about that in another video. But for now, that's it. My starting guide to making cider. Take care.